Hello, welcome to Unoptimized Evolution. This is Eric Jacobus. Today I want to talk about technological society. This is the phenomenon that people like Tec Kaczynski, I hope I don't get censored for talking about this madman. Tec Kaczynski and various other writers have talked much about in the past, about how technological society has gotten out of control. It's sort of taken on a mind of its own. And Tec Kaczynski is not the first. By the way, Tec Kaczynski is the Unabomber for those of you who are not familiar with this man. And he wrote a book. You know what? I'm not going to show it. I think I'll get in trouble. He wrote a book called the Something Manifesto. You can figure it out for yourself. I don't really know what the algorithm censors anymore. I apologize. But this is something that Jacques Ellul and Louis Mumford talked about as well in their works. Mumford, I just finished reading this. It's called Technics and Civilization. It talks about the sort of evolution, I guess you could say, or the development of the machine. Jacques Ellul wrote The Technological Society, similar concept, and there are various other authors like Eric Moonman and other people who wrote about this phenomenon where machines have sort of, at least they seem to have taken on a mind of their own, and this seems to really bother some people. So to start with, a quick history from Louis Mumford, who has a very firm grasp on the history of machines. Essentially, Technics and Civilization is one of his earlier books. It was written in the interwar period between World War I, World War II. He writes about, you think about the time period. This is a time when the expansion of the military-industrial complex, or industrialization, whatever you want to call it, resulted in this sort of arms race that led into World War I. The arms race was primarily between England and Germany, with the development of the British constantly developing the Spitfire and their boats, and then of course the Germans developing their boats. And this is something also that William McNeill wrote about in Pursuit of Power, although this is a far more, what would you say, this is a far more just like flat approach. McNeill comes across as somebody who has no issue with machines growing out of control, right? You get the sensation that someone like Louis Mumford and definitely Jacques Ellul and definitely Tec Kaczynski have sort of a problem with the fact that machines are starting to take on a sort of mind of their own. And so in Technics and Civilization, Mumford traces the history of machinery through three eras, which are the Eotechnic Phase, Paleotechnic Phase, and the Neotechnic Phase. The Eotechnic Phase essentially begins with water power, the water wheel. You put a wheel where you divert some water from the canal, you put it over a wheel, and that wheel spins, and it spins a turbine, it crushes grain or whatever it's going to do, right? Wind power is the same kind of thing, right? A lot of the technologies of that era started with wind and water power. And then you have various other, techniques that emerged at that time, like glass. And glass allowed for chemistry because it's a great medium to experiment in because it doesn't react with whatever you put into it. And lenses, of course, and the lens lends itself to making for, of course you can see further into space, you can see smaller things under a microscope. It creates what he calls a new demonology, where you get to see bacteria. And also the development of the lens and of the mirror, this produces a more, maybe you could say, egocentric kind of philosopher like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and a lot of these people also came from lens making, and that's a very fascinating sort of connection to make, right? So so that's the Eotechnic Phase, and the Eotechnic Phase sort of culminates into, and that goes from about like 1100 until about, I believe he puts it around 1650s, 1700 or so. In the Eotechnic Phase, most of the machinery of the Eotechnic Phase is just sort of to enhance human work. It's to enhance human strength and speed. You still have to put the work in. If you have a drill, you still have to move the drill. It's just more economical now. Various tools that were created, turbines and things like that, that you still need something to power it, and a lot of it is human powered. But it's by no means some kind of runaway machine yet, until the Paleotechnic Phase. And the Paleotechnic Phase begins around the 1700s. This is essentially the coal and iron phase. And during coal and iron, you have, of course, the development of these like massively productive and also very dirty and wasteful industries that cause tons of pollution. They relocate people to coal mining towns, and then those towns work the coal mines, make a bunch of iron, and then once the mine is gone, once the mine is used up, they'll leave the town. You get all these coal mining towns that are these ghost towns. And the Paleotechnic Phase is just a sort of transition point. But it's when you start to see these huge developments in ironworking. Now, ironworking, of course, had been around ever since the 12th century BC, probably before that too. China has, of course, its own sort of separate timeline there. They actually started a little bit earlier, and their steel development was very advanced as opposed to, say, gunpowder. They didn't utilize gunpowder in the same way that Europeans did. And so the Paleotechnic Phase is this massive reorganization of society. Now, bear in mind too, the Eotechnic Phase culminated in what was starting to become the steam engine. And the steam engine really started to take shape in the Paleotechnic Phase. And that was when things really started changing. Not only were people massively relocated, pulled from rural areas into these urban centers and put into these tenements or these tract housing, essentially done just in order to cram as many people near the mine or near the iron manufacturing plant as possible. But also the steam engine then was starting to be introduced to speed up production in these facilities. And so naturally, as steam engines started proliferating throughout society, Watt installed these things all over the place. He gives specific numbers in here of how many steam engines Watt installed throughout Europe, right? And so this obviously sped up production significantly. In some industries, it sped it up by 1,000-fold, right? You could produce fabrics with the steam engine now you could do them 1,000 times more quickly than you could by hand. And then the Neotechnic Phase is the phase that begins around like the late 1800s. The Neotechnic Phase is steel and the use of plastics. And it's sort of like what I would say would be the pre-semiconductor phase of society. And this is the phase that was very much responsible for the arms race that led up to World War I. And then in Mumford's time, it's probably also responsible for a lot of what, built up to World War II, although he doesn't anticipate it. Mumford's entire angle through this history is that the machine starts to sort of take on its own identity. It has its own demands. When you install a machine, when this company installs this machine over here, the goal is to maximize profit. And Mumford is very critical of capitalism that emerges with the machine. Because when you have these machines running all the time and they're increasing production and making things very cheap, but they're also reducing the number of laborers that you need, it starts causing a lot of dislocation. These are things that Marx and Engels were obviously very critical of. And so a lot of this is some kind of, he proposes a recipe for communism, and this is all stuff this was a very common thing to do in the interwar period, because it seemed like, oh yeah, you could create a planned society, and he cites the USSR as a great example of a country that's doing this properly. So I would like to see what he says about the USSR after World War II, or after the Cold War anyway. Part of this idea of the machine that starts taking on its own identity. It's not literally that the machine can operate itself, but it is this very sort of new phenomenon where human effort is being applied to something that sort of resembles language. It sort of resembles like writing something down on paper. When you write down an idea on paper, or you sketch it into, or you etch it into rock, it stays there forever, or for as long as it can, remain without decaying. But it doesn't do anything, right? It's not productive on its own accord. In order to change it, you have to go in and physically change it, right? With the machine, it's sort of like you build something that can just sort of work without you applying anything to it, which as a concept is very new. The closest thing would have been animal domestication. And domesticated animals were essentially the first machines, in a sense. You had a lot of people like Descartes saying that animals were just automatons. He treated them like machines. We know that they're not actually machines. We know that they do actually have complicated behaviors that are not just inputs and outputs, right? I think we've sort of underestimated animals, at least we did back then. But when it comes to domesticated animals, it was the first sort of way in which we could acquire some kind of resource and put it to use for us and let it go without having to touch it. And that's very different than any other kind of labor. It's very different than standard language. So with a machine, though, you don't need the animal. It'll basically do whatever you want it to do. You don't have to feed it the same sort of way, obviously. And so this is something that Jacques Ellul talks about at length in Technological Society. I believe he wrote this in 1960 something or other, 64. And Ellul is very critical of the runaway tendencies of machines. And Ellul sort of imagined these machines, and he's writing 30 years after Mumford wrote Technics and Civilization. Ellul also sees machines playing a very integral part in mass media, which was instrumental in propaganda campaigns in Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and also America, right? And he has a book, I don't have it right now, he has a book called Propaganda, which is fantastic. And it talks all about, he talks all about the three different propagandas, and he just compares the three of them. And Technological Society is sort of like a backbone to that, where you have a machine that allows for proliferation of whatever your message is going to be. And in essence, it creates the medium that allows propaganda to really propagate. Because if you think about what language is, all language is attempted propaganda in a sense, because if I'm telling you something, right now, I'm talking to you, I'm demanding your attention. I'm not telling you to turn off this video, right? I'm not telling you to go switch over to another video. I'm telling you to watch this, right? And so that is me telling you what to look at. The only difference between that and Soviet or Nazi or American propaganda or whatever propaganda is that I may not be able to make as many people do it, right? And my message might not propagate to as many people. And so machines allow one to propagate the information. Hitler was very good at utilizing the machinery of mass media and the radio to propagate his message. So for Ellul, he sees the machine developing as this sort of not a symbiotic organism. I mean, it starts to become its own independent organism. And then, of course, Tec Kaczynski, he saw Technological Society as this runaway sort of parasite in society that was talking to him, issuing imperatives and commands, right? And his resolution to that was to kill people. So weird, obviously the wrong thing to do. Jacques Ellul doesn't really have a great solution to it. Maybe because he saw that Mumford was advocating for Soviet communism, and that didn't exactly stop the machine. But it is an interesting look into their minds and into Tec Kaczynski's mind, because when something like a machine is able to exist and still bother you, and as an individual, if you are watching and paying attention to that machine. And it's sort of what I would say is its intents are bearing on you. The fact that it exists, the fact that social media exists, the fact that CNN and Fox News exist, the fact that Russia and China and Trump and Biden, the fact that they exist, even though they're not machines, but the means for propagating their messages, those do exist. And it sort of draws us into, it sort of draws us to them. And this is what language does as well. Anybody who has a megaphone on the corner can like shout imperatives and tell you to look over here. Hey, I'm saying this thing, right? And even if you walk away, even if you go the next town over, you might still think about that guy who's preaching on the corner and go like, man, I really want to like go and hear that guy's message, or man, I really want to go and punch that guy in the face, whatever it's going to be, right? The fact is, his intents are bearing upon you. And this is something that I've written about on the website quite a bit. The idea of the internal motor representation. Rizzolatti talks about that in Mirrors in the Brain. The internal motor representation is essentially this virtualization that you run that is a virtualization of whatever intent is out there. Right? So if it's a volcano that's going to erupt, you build an internal motor representation, or an IMR, as I say. You build an IMR of this volcano that, if you see it smoking, the intent is that it wants to erupt, right? And because we're human, because we anthropomorphize all intents that go into us, we naturally sort of anthropomorphize a volcano as some kind of chief that demands a sacrifice, right? So we'll go and we'll throw chicken into it or whatever. Similarly, if you, James Fraser talks about, I can't find the passage, but there's this amazing part in The Golden Bough where he talks about this tribe that was fearful of these buffalo that were armed with spears. Now, obviously, buffalo can't fight with spears, but the fact that the tribe itself could use spears, and the fact that the buffalo, or maybe it was lions, or some kind, it might have actually been a predatory animal. The fact that this animal was predatory, they were sort of anthropomorphizing the intent of the animal and applying the threat of having a spear as well. I don't think that they would just make this up to, kind of like bolster their courage or whatever it is. I think that there might have been some legitimate fear that this was happening. Just the same as if you were to walk into an empty room or like an abandoned building, right? And if the lights go out suddenly, well, you're no longer in an abandoned building. You're now in a ghost chamber, or whatever it is that comes into your mind. And this is just what we do. We tend to conjure up images of spirits, demons, old relatives, things that we saw on some Netflix horror movie or whatever it's going to be. And that stuff will start bearing on you. Those intents will bear on you. And it's no different from ancient society. They just did the same thing. They didn't quite have a great way to resolve animal predators, and so they sort of anticipated that these predators were out there with spears ready to attack them. Even though you never would have seen animals do that, the intent was powerful enough for you to think that they were going to do that, right? So I mention this because it's the same sort of thinking that people like, I think Ellul might have thought this way, and Tec Kaczynski openly talks about, where the machines are sort of talking to them, and they're issuing these commands, and they're requiring that you do something. And this is, again, what happens when you anthropomorphize something like a machine. If you're not able to imagine a machine as just a machine, as something that just has cogs and gears and belts and whatnot, you start to anthropomorphize it, and then it starts talking to you, and then it tells you to kill people, and then you get Tec Kaczynski. And you get other people, too, with these schizoid personalities who might have a very difficult time, going about in a mechanized society. Anytime you have a proliferation of machinery and in general a sort of carpentered society like we have now, especially in cities. And when I say carpentered, I mean a lot of right angles, a lot of automation, a lot of things that you just wouldn't see in nature, right? You don't really see any right angles in nature. You don't really see any perfect circles except for water droplets and maybe some eyes and the center of a flower. Otherwise, nature is kind of random. It's very strange to see these right angles of a city poking out in nature. And I think that it might be that, schizoid personality types find that these things are talking to them. And most are able to deal with that and issue responses back. They're able to, if a building, for example, if a building feels to them oppressive, right? And you've seen this, right? You've seen various, maybe critical theorists talking about skyscrapers as if they're phallic or whatever it's going to be. And some of that is, critical theory, but some of it is also they're sort of just trying to resolve the intent load of a building, right? I mean, if a building is issuing some kind of command onto you, and the command could be very simple. The command could simply be, I'm here, I'm tall, I've destroyed this place, whatever it is, I'm on an Indian burial ground, whatever it is, then that sort of starts to kickstart this internal dialogue or internal monologue where this person feels like this building's talking to them. This might explain, I could be wrong, but this might explain why schizoid personality types are shouting at the sky in cities. Because, like Tec Kaczynski, they see carpentered society and machinery as having a sort of mind of its own, much the same that ancient societies saw bison as having spears, much that the ancient Maori society saw, or Fijians saw volcanoes as being these chiefs that demanded sacrifices. Ultimately, the machine is an amalgamation of sort of a linguistic input, right? Because if you were to think about how you make a machine, well, you're sort of decoding effort and re-encoding it into this sort of mechanized form that can be duplicated and manufactured, and you put it here and you let it run. You sort of like offload a little bit of your language onto this thing, and this is how I sort of think of it now. I also think of it's not simply language, it's that this is the recursive property. Language is recursive. Violence is recursive. My robot hypothesis states that recursion is the minimum human property, and it just sort of flows between active violent states and symbolic language states. And I think that machines are somewhere over in the linguistic side, except that when you have a machine, if you put recursion, right, you're sort of like linguistic effort. And when I say linguistic effort, I mean you have formulas and equations and rules and metallurgy and all this stuff. There's like a lot of culture that goes into a machine, right? Like I look at this, and I'm kind of amazed by like a steel water container, right? Like they have to make the steel. You have to get the iron. You have to mix the iron. You have to obviously carbonize the iron and mix it with whatever other elements to create the alloy of steel. It's going to be a certain kind of steel that you can stamp. Then you need an actual press to stamp this thing. I mean, how do you even stamp that, right? So this is like incredibly complicated. You have to also bore the screw, and then you have to make this plastic cap thing. And then there's like more pieces of this plastic. And there's like this like more rubbery plastic one up here. And then there's this mouthpiece too. And this mouthpiece is like kind of designed not to break apart in your mouth. Although one of my sons has managed to do that anyway. The whole thing is kind of incredible. And my response to that incredibleness is not to treat this thing like it's some kind of a human. My response to that is, well, I'm kind of interested in knowing how that whole process works. And so when okay, now I have to figure out what I was just talking about. In that way, when you make something like this steel water container, you're dumping a ton of language and culture in this thing. And then when you make it, you just kind of leave it, and you can expect it to be there tomorrow. That thing's going to last probably for 100 years, at least the bottom part of it is. And that to me is very liberating. Some people might find it kind of daunting. Some people have a hard time having like a router in their house, right? They feel like it's sort of alive and talking to them. I've talked to people who are very afraid of waves and Wi-Fi waves. They sort of equate them with demons, and they'll hear things with waves and cell phone towers and all this. And we could discuss whether or not these things are actually causing cancer, and there might be truth to that. But I think a lot of the time it stems from something that's a little bit deeper and more visceral, which is this idea that if people are dumping their language, their recursive kind of energy into these manufactured products, it's sort of like a bundle of language that is talking. And some personality types have a hard time with that. And other personality types, like myself, I have no problem with that stuff just sitting there, and I can predict that it's there. This is sort of how I've been built. I'm much more on like the autistic side of thinking. And I have a much harder time in a group, in like a room full of people where I'm inundated by people moving this way and that way, and I get like exhausted within about an hour. But if I'm in a room full of computers and machinery, I can kind of figure the thing out and like live in there for the rest of my life. I have no problem with that. And I think it's the inverse with schizoid personality types. And what Tec Kaczynski, he was kind of onto something. The killing part, no. But he was onto this idea that technological society is sort of running away from him. For people like me, I'm always pushing toward that because I like that predictability. I like being able to offload as much recursive content into these mechanized things, into machines, computer code, and all that. And like I'm winning. Like my type of thinking is winning. Like there is more of that today than yesterday, and that has been the case for the past 2,000 years, easily. I can't think of a single time when it's gone the other way for longer than a month, right? Maybe during a recession, and then things like pick up right away again. And so I can understand why someone like, Ellul and Mumford, they see things sort of going in what they would see as the wrong direction. And people like me would see it as going in the right direction. Machines, they're great receptacles for recursive content, the recursive stuff that makes us human. When I say recursive, I mean the ability to sort of anticipate that it is anticipating us. I don't fear that machines are looking at me. Of course, it's possible. Of course, it's possible that people are spying on you with your phone, and that's obviously an issue. I don't fear it. I can see why some people do, because on the other end of that is another person. You're trying to figure out what they're planning. They are intent loading onto you as an individual. Your object is intent loading onto you. And that is what a lot of these authors seem to be getting at, is that the more mechanized we become, the higher tech we get, the more we have AI, for example, and everything is sort of consolidated into these like very complex machines, and now it's computer code. And I would say that if Mumford were alive today, he would probably say that we are in the post-Neotechnic age. This is probably like Silicotechnic. I don't know what he would call it, right? It's like the transistor probably is what really changed the integrated circuit. The more that you have that, the more these machines and carpentered society in general, manufactured society, technological society, the more it starts issuing imperatives and commanding you and demanding that you fulfill these things, like the workday. Mumford's very critical of like the work week, right? He says that you used to be able to just work like a leisurely 20-hour week or something. I don't know where he's getting that from. Maybe, the peasants didn't really have a 20-hour work week as far as I know. Artisans, they sort of lived in their work. They didn't have a 20-hour work week for the most part, but I can see what he's getting at, which is that there wasn't a machine that you were sort of chasing. There was no timekeeping before, before the 15th century or so? I mean, with the introduction of the clock, especially the home clock, it started out as a water clock, but then when the domestic clock came around, then everybody could keep a schedule. Right, and then when you start introducing a standardized time, which it was originally just church bells, and you had sunrise and sunset. That's sort of how you kept time. Once you had standardized time, then you can sort of keep people on this rhythm, and you keep people on a rhythm in order to maintain the machine. It's not really the other way around, and that's Mumford's criticism of capitalism. And so you can see how it becomes this compulsion for someone like him. And maybe Marx was like this. Maybe Marx and Engels, in Communist Manifesto, and I assume Das Kapital, maybe they were inundated by the machine, and the only way that they thought that you could resolve this is by taking control of it and stopping it or putting a brake on it. And that just, I'm sure that there are some out there who are very complimentary about communist ideals. I doubt many people would be complimentary about how it's worked out in the past. Hasn't produced the best outcomes. One could argue that we just need international cooperation, and the idea of nuclear non-proliferation was, if we could all cooperate at least on disarming nukes, we could maybe cooperate on reducing the work week or fixing prices or, creating some kind of a rational production society, right? This is another thing that Mumford advances. And a lot of this is like this very, you would say, like scientistic view that you can just apply science and rationality to humans, and you figure out what people need, and you figure out the production. You just sort of make the two meet, and then you'll have, you have a short bread line, right? And it just never works that way, because like we have today with the mainstream scientific thinkers, there's no way that you can actually you can't run analytics on people like that. We don't work like that, and we don't have a theory on it either. And I keep on saying this: we don't even have a theory on language. And so, how can we even have a theory on society? How can we have a theory on behavior? We've tried so many times. Skinner being, the big behaviorist, Dollard and Doob pushing this idea that, all you really have to do is reduce frustration and plan cities properly, and you'll get rid of aggression. Didn't work. This was in the 40s. Didn't work. Walden 2, the perfect utopian society, B.F. Skinner's whole thing. And so, what is the solution? Well, Ellul never talks about a solution, which I find kind of fascinating with Ellul. He writes ethical books, which is why I enjoy I think he might be a Marxist, but he's just like an ethical. He's a Christian too. He wrote, there's one called Violence, where he said, under no circumstances are you to engage in violence. Zero. No circumstances. He's being critical of like anti-war demonstrators who were, doing revolutionary violence as well. Ellul doesn't have a society, like a social plan. He has an ethic, which I think is commendable. Whereas people like Mumford, he's advocating, and of course Marx, they're advocating these systems, these political systems that everybody should get with. These are very interesting times, I think. I think what we're going to see is that there's a lot of people like this. And technological society is going to exacerbate whatever, manic, schizoid sort of personality they have, and it might create more and more sort of obsessions with technology. They might be calling for more and more demands to put brakes on AI. They're going to ask to put brakes on computer coding. And then the other side of the debate, which is going to be my side, although I don't really engage in this debate, but the people on my side are going to be the ones saying like, well, no, it's just going to kind of go the way that it needs to go. I think we can be very critical of that side too. I think we can be critical of both sides. I think on the schizoid, manic schizoid side, and I don't mean to offend anybody by using this terminology. I do think that there is a pretty clear dividing line in personality types between the introverts and the extroverts. I find that introverts tend to fall along the kind of Asperger, autistic side of the spectrum, and the more extroverted types tend to fall onto manic and schizoid personality types. And it's less of a spectrum, it's much more of a knife edge. I don't think anybody's in the middle. I think you fall pretty hard off of either side. So when I use that terminology, please don't take offense. I'm really just trying to differentiate without any kind of, I'm not making a value judgment on it, right? Because the schizoid manic personality is very good within groups of people, and the autistic personality is very good in groups of machines and predictability, right? The two are very important, and I think that they've always been important. I just think that now, as things are becoming more automated, you're going to see the one side reacting very negatively and the other side reacting very positively. I don't think that you have to necessarily fall hard on either side. You can acknowledge that these things are just going to sort of continue going the way that they go, because the more linguistic energy we put into it, well, the more it's going to keep going, right? Even if we focus on AI, even if we talk about AI, even if you discuss the latest scandals, the latest, drag queen story hour this, or like Trump and court that, like the more you talk about it, the more you sort of pay attention to it, and the more you make other people pay attention to it, and the more you sort of grow those media channels, right? So it doesn't really, like, you can't really put a brake on something by talking about it, right? But I think that, so we're going to talk about it no matter what. It is the center of attention, right? And this is like a keystone feature of generative anthropology. Eric Gann's Origin of Language, please read it, it's very good. The technology and the machine is very much at the center of our society now. The problem that we have to face now, in my view, is that we do not have a theory on language. If we're building a language model, we don't have a theory on it. We don't have a theory of recursion, because the people making these machines, these artificial intelligence machines, well, they think they know what they think they've figured it out. They sort of proceed as though the theory will present itself, right? Like the Wright brothers, they didn't have a theory of flight, but they did model the thing after a bird wing, right? So they had something to go off. Whereas with LLMs, it's not quite the same thing, because you are using all possible. It would be like taking all possible bird wings, right, and running it through a regression of some kind, and then developing a wing, which would be a monstrosity, right? You'd run an autocomplete on it basically, and it just takes a long time for that to work. It's the same thing with an LLM. LLMs didn't really get any good until they just started doing an autocomplete system based on all written data that you can possibly get your hands on. But the thing is that this is not actually language. All you're doing is reproducing what has been produced already. It's not actually language. And by saying that language is the minimum human property, you are negating all the other things that we do that are linguistic, right? In fact, you're negating the things that are recursive. Language is recursive, so is violence. So if an LLM and these machines, if they're being built as though language is what makes us human, well, then you're missing a totally different aspect of what makes us human. We're missing the violence part. And it's not that we need to program them to be violent. We need to program them to know what the relationship is between violence and language, which nobody is really very serious about. Nobody is putting this forward. Everybody just says violence is bad, do away with it. Well, I'm out here saying, like, yeah, violence is bad, and it's like the same stuff as language. It's just in a different state. So that's my critique of my side, is that my side thinks that it has the minimum human property, right? And I'm reading a lot of universals right now. Donald Brown's Human Universals doesn't talk about violence. Nobody really talks about violence as a human universal. They should. You absolutely need to acknowledge that. If it's not built into your machine, then you can only treat it like an autocomplete system. You should not treat it as if it's human intelligence. You just can't. Just don't even call it intelligence. Call it fake language. Call it autocomplete. And I think that if we proceed like this and we keep talking about AI like it's going to become sentient, well, we don't even have a theory on sentience. We don't have a theory on any human behavior now. So whoever is out there saying that such and such thing is sentient, I don't trust them, because I don't think that their theory on language or sentience is even valid. How do you react to machines? Do you feel them in your life? Do you feel this presence? Does it bother you? Do they keep you up at night? Do you have a hard time sleeping, right? Or do you enjoy them? Does it help you sleep at night? For me, I sleep so easily knowing that something is out in the bedroom, in the kitchen, just working. I sleep great as a result, and it's just a personality difference, These are very good books. Not that one. But the Technics and Civilizations, very good. It's a very good historical book. I highly recommend reading them. Jacques Ellul is still the best, though. That's all I have to say. So thank you. Smash that bell and like the subscribe button, and go tell your mom you love her. All right, goodbye.